It was June 4, 1942. Somewhere in the vast blue silence northwest of Midway Atoll, the fate of the Pacific War was being decided. And Admiral Chester W. Nimitz was not in his command center. He was on a pistol range. His staff knew where to find him. They had seen this before. While other commanders paced, while generals chewed on corncob pipes and stared at walls, Nimitz stepped outside, picked up his pistol, and shot targets. Methodically, patiently, one round at a time. At that very moment, hundreds of American pilots were diving through anti-aircraft fire toward 4 of Japan's most powerful aircraft carriers. Men were dying. Planes were falling into the sea. The outcome of the entire war in the Pacific hung on decisions already made. Decisions that could no longer be changed by any amount of worry, any act of will, any desperate signal from Pearl Harbor. Nimitz understood something that very few commanders in history have ever truly understood. That in the space between decision and outcome, the only weapon a commander has left is his own mind. And a panicked mind is no weapon at all. So he shot his pistol. And America won the Pacific War. If you want to understand how the United States defeated Imperial Japan, not just the strategy, not just the battles, but the human architecture of command that made it possible, then stay with me. Because this story begins not with a fleet, but with a prescription from a doctor, a field of horseshoes, and a man who refused to let the war inside his head. And if you find value in stories like this, real history, told with the depth it deserves, subscribe to this channel. Hit that bell. There are more stories like this one waiting for you. Christmas morning, 1941. Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. A steady rain fell from low clouds over the harbor. A 4-engine flying boat descended through the gray haze and touched down in East Lock. The man who stepped off that plane wore civilian clothes. He had no entourage, no ceremony. His name was Chester William Nimitz, and he had just been handed command of the most damaged naval force in American history. What he saw as his barge moved through the harbor was almost incomprehensible. The sides, hulls, and crazily jutting superstructures of American battleships lay where they had fallen. USS Arizona still burning below the waterline, USS Oklahoma rolled onto her side, USS West Virginia resting on the harbor floor. 18 ships damaged or destroyed. 2,403 Americans dead. The Pacific Fleet's battle line, the backbone of American naval power, was gone. The officers of Admiral Kimmel's staff filed into the room to meet their new commander. They expected the worst. Many of them had been present at the greatest American military disaster since the Civil War. They expected to be relieved in disgrace, their careers finished before they had fully begun. Nimitz looked at them and said that any man who wanted a transfer could count on his help. But he hoped most of them would stay. He needed them. That single act, choosing to rebuild rather than punish, to trust rather than purge, told you everything about the kind of commander Chester Nimitz was going to be. It was not sentiment, it was strategy. He understood that the men in that room carried irreplaceable institutional knowledge of the Pacific theater. Destroying their careers would destroy that knowledge with it. On December 31st, 1941, Nimitz formally assumed command of the Pacific Fleet. He stood not on a ship's bridge, but on the deck of the submarine USS Grayling, one of the few vessels in Pearl Harbor still fully operational. It was a deliberate choice. Nimitz was an old submariner, and perhaps more than that. Submarines were the weapons that still worked. The war had just begun, and on paper, Japan was winning everything. To understand what Nimitz was carrying, you have to understand the strategic situation in early 1942. Japan's carrier strike force, the Kido Butai, the most powerful concentration of naval air power the world had ever seen, was essentially undefeated. It had destroyed the American battle line at Pearl Harbor. It had struck Darwin, Australia, in February 1942. It had driven the Royal Navy from the Indian Ocean in April. Japanese ground forces had taken the Philippines, Malaya, Singapore, Burma, the Dutch East Indies, and Wake Island. The perimeter of Japanese control stretched from the Aleutian Islands to the coast of India. Nimitz commanded a fleet that was outnumbered, outgunned, and demoralized. He had 3 aircraft carriers against Japan's 10. He had submarines, cruisers, destroyers, but no battle line, no battleships to anchor a conventional engagement. Every decision he made carried consequences that could not be undone. And the pressure did not come only from the enemy. From Washington, Admiral Ernest King, the chief of naval operations, a brilliant but volcanic figure known for his temper, demanded results while simultaneously second-guessing Nimitz's every operational choice. From the Southwest Pacific, General Douglas MacArthur treated inter-service cooperation as a personal insult and competed for resources, for credit, for the attention of the president. Reporters arrived in waves, hungry for drama, frustrated that Nimitz would not give it to them. Time magazine correspondent Robert Sherrod wrote that Nimitz was frequently the despair of his public relations men. It simply was not in him to make sweeping statements or give out colorful interviews. War correspondents who expected admirals to pound tables and bellow were, as historian Samuel Eliot Morison put it, apt to wonder, is this the man? It was, completely. But the calm exterior concealed something his closest aides could only glimpse in private. Nimitz knew that every order he issued might result in letters arriving at American homes, letters that began with the words, "We regret to inform you." He admitted to his aide, Lieutenant Lamar, that he had to send people to their deaths. Some orders cost thousands of lives. The letters arrived. "You killed my son on Tarawa," one grieving mother wrote. And then another. And another. The war stresses manifested themselves physically. Nimitz lost weight. He suffered from chronic insomnia, recurring malaria, and persistent digestive problems that his fleet surgeon watched with increasing concern. It was that fleet surgeon who would, in time, write one of the most important prescriptions of the Pacific War. The doctor's name was Rear Admiral Thomas C. Anderson, Doc to those who knew him. His job was to keep Admiral Nimitz functional for the duration of the most demanding naval command in American history. And Doc Anderson understood something that modern neuroscience would later confirm, that the human mind cannot sustain the kind of cognitive load Nimitz was carrying without periodic, complete interruption. The prescription, he wrote, was not a medication. It was an activity. Target shooting. Doc Anderson recommended pistol practice to Nimitz for a specific reason, and his reasoning was precise enough that it was recorded and passed down through the historical record. The fleet surgeon explained that he recommended target practice for relaxation because, as he put it, in shooting a pistol, one can think of nothing else but pulling the trigger. Read that again. In shooting a pistol, one can think of nothing else but pulling the trigger. This was not a casual observation. It was a clinical insight into the psychology of high command. Doc Anderson had diagnosed the specific problem, a mind that never stopped processing the war, that turned over plans and casualties and intelligence reports at 0200 when the lights were out, that could not locate an off switch. And he had identified the solution, an activity that demanded such complete physical and visual focus, the sight picture, the breath control, the trigger press, that it temporarily made the war impossible to think about. It was, in modern terms, a forced cognitive reset, a circuit breaker for a mind running at dangerous amperage. Nimitz took the prescription seriously. At his headquarters at Macalapa Hill in Pearl Harbor, he built a pistol range. When he later relocated his command to Guam as American forces pushed ever closer to Japan, he built another one, mirroring the Macalapa range exactly, as if the range itself were a piece of equipment as essential to the war effort as a radar set or a cipher machine. On Guam, he enlisted anyone at hand to join him at the range. Officers, aides, members of his intelligence staff. His intelligence chief, Captain Edwin T. Layton, practiced with him daily. By the time Japan surrendered in September 1945, Lamar estimated that he and Nimitz had fired together at least 500,000 rounds. 500,000 rounds. The prescription had become a ritual. The ritual had become a weapon. But the pistol range was only one part of a larger system Nimitz had constructed, deliberately or instinctively, to protect his ability to command. Outside his command quarters at Macalapa, he built a horseshoe court. He played nearly every day, often challenging junior officers and enlisted men to compete with him. He swam. He hiked. He maintained friendships with a prominent Honolulu couple, Sandy and Una Walker, who gave him access to their 6-acre beach house on Oahu's North Shore, a place Nimitz called a refuge from the demands of command, where he could walk, swim, dine, and play poker. His grandsons later called it his own private USO. At 11 o'clock most mornings, Nimitz held open visiting hours at his headquarters. Any commander passing through Pearl Harbor was expected to stop by. "Glad to have you with us," Nimitz would say, then motion the visitor to a chair and begin asking what one historian described as penetrating questions. In fact, almost anyone with something to say could get in to see the admiral. This was not social graciousness. It was intelligence gathering. It was the systematic construction of a picture of the war that no map could fully provide. The texture of morale, the real condition of ships, the spirit of men who had been in actual combat, while Nimitz had not. Because here is a fact about Chester Nimitz that is easy to overlook. He had never experienced combat before World War II. He had never seen a shot fired in anger. The fleet did not need, as Ian W. Toll wrote, a show of blood and thunder after the beating it had suffered. There was plenty of the real stuff to go around. What it needed was an executive, a strategist, a leader who could think clearly when the pressure was most acute. And during tense moments, while awaiting word of the outcome of battles he had planned but could not control, witnesses recorded that Nimitz would joke with his staff while he calmly practiced on his pistol range or tossed ringers with horseshoes just outside his office. The contrast with Douglas MacArthur was stark, documented, and deliberate. MacArthur, in those same moments, would as a rule sit stonily in his chair, chewing on the stem of a corncob pipe. Two commanders, two temperaments, two entirely different relationships to uncertainty. MacArthur tried to master uncertainty through concentration, through the sheer force of his will pressing against the wall of the unknowable. Nimitz accepted uncertainty as the fundamental condition of war, and built a practice that allowed him to step outside it briefly and return refreshed. All of this comes into focus at the Battle of Midway, June 4th through 7, 1942. By late May 1942, Nimitz's signals intelligence team at Station Hypo, working under Commander Joseph Rochefort, had done something extraordinary. They had broken enough of Japan's naval code JN-25B to determine that Japan was planning a massive strike on a location coded AF. Nimitz's intelligence officer, Lieutenant Commander Edwin Layton, was convinced that AF meant Midway Atoll. To confirm it, Nimitz authorized an elegant deception. He ordered Midway to broadcast an uncoded transmission claiming the island was running low on fresh water. Within hours, American intercept operators picked up a Japanese message reporting that AF was short on fresh water. The trap was confirmed. Midway was the target. Now, Nimitz faced a decision of enormous risk. He had 3 aircraft carriers against what would prove to be 4 Japanese fleet carriers, the most battle-hardened carrier force in the world, fresh from their triumphs at Pearl Harbor, Darwin, and the Indian Ocean. His 3rd carrier, the Yorktown, was limping back from the Battle of the Coral Sea, with damage that Pearl Harbor engineers estimated would require 3 months of repairs. Nimitz ordered the work done in 72 hours. The Yorktown sailed. He made a further decision that required uncommon discipline. He issued his fleet commanders, Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher and Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance, broad, clear intent, and then gave them room to execute. He would not micromanage commanders on the scene when they knew the immediate situation best. When members of his staff urged him to issue more specific directives, he refused. This was not passivity. It was a philosophy of command built on trust, on confidence in the men he had selected, on the understanding that the fog of battle makes remote control not just ineffective, but actively dangerous. And when the ships were at sea, when the planes were in the air, when the dice were rolling across the table of history and nothing Nimitz could do would change the outcome, he went to the pistol range. On June 4th, as American dive bombers found the Japanese carrier force northwest of Midway, as SBD Dauntless aircraft from the USS Enterprise and USS Yorktown swept down through anti-aircraft fire and turned the decks of Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu into infernos, Admiral Chester Nimitz was doing exactly what his fleet surgeon had prescribed, thinking of nothing else but pulling the trigger. The battle unfolded over 4 days. When the final reports came in, 4 Japanese fleet carriers had been sunk: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, along with the heavy cruiser Mikuma, and over 3,000 Japanese sailors and airmen, including many of the irreplaceable, highly trained naval aviators who had opened the war at Pearl Harbor. The United States lost the Yorktown and the destroyer Hamon. It was, as historians have judged ever since, the turning point of the Pacific War. Nimitz could not resist a small piece of wordplay in his communiqué of June 6th. "Pearl Harbor," he wrote, "has now been partially avenged. Vengeance will not be complete until Japanese sea power is reduced to impotence. We have made substantial progress in that direction. Perhaps we will be forgiven if we claim that we are about midway to that objective." What made Nimitz's ritual remarkable was not simply that it helped him personally. It shaped the entire culture of his command. When the admiral walked calmly to the pistol range during a crisis, his staff received a message as clear as any operational order. We are in control of ourselves. Therefore, we are capable of controlling the outcome. Panic is contagious, but so is calm. Nimitz's unhurried demeanor during the most dangerous hours of the Pacific War became a form of command communication. Wordless, powerful, and impossible to fake. His Naval Academy yearbook, published in 1905, had described the young midshipman Chester Nimitz with a line from Wordsworth: "A man he seems of cheerful yesterdays and confident tomorrows." The yearbook added, "possesses that calm and steady-going Dutch way that gets to the bottom of things." 40 years later, that was still the man. In one of the most acute characterizations of his command style, historian Robert William Love wrote that Nimitz brought a sense of inner balance and calm that steadied those around him. He had the ability to pick able subordinates and the courage to let them do their jobs without interference. He molded disparate, sometimes explosive personalities: the bold and aggressive William Bull Halsey, the quiet and analytical Raymond Spruance, the difficult and territorial Richmond Kelly Turner, into what historians have described as one of the finest fighting teams in military history. He did it through trust, through humor, through selective delegation, and through the daily discipline of maintaining his own equilibrium. The pistol range was not a distraction from command. It was a component of it. By January 1945, the war had moved. American island-hopping campaigns had seized the Marianas, the Philippines were being liberated, and the final drive toward Japan itself was underway. Nimitz relocated his headquarters to Guam, bringing his command closer to the action, and, as he noted with some satisfaction, farther from Washington, which he hoped would discourage at least some of the constant stream of VIP visitors that had complicated his life in Pearl Harbor. He brought his routine with him. He built the new horseshoe court. He built the pistol range, a mirror of the Macalapa range, precise in every dimension. He continued his daily walks, his evening cocktails on the lanai, with a view over the western Pacific, his communal dinners where he was known to tell jokes for an hour straight, a vast and ever-growing repertoire that he replenished by trading stories with every cardinal, congressman, and commander who passed through. The physical costs of command were now visible. The Walkers, his old friends from Honolulu, were shocked by his deteriorating health when he stopped briefly in Hawaii en route from a meeting with Admiral King. They wrote a confidential letter to his fleet surgeon expressing their alarm. Nimitz was losing weight. The insomnia and digestive ailments had worsened under the accumulated strain of 4 years of command. But on the pistol range, on the horseshoe court, on the long hikes through the Guam hills with his Schnauzer Mack trotting beside him, he remained capable, functional, clear-eyed. The war in the Pacific was entering its final, terrible phase. The island battles of Iwo Jima and Okinawa, the firebombing of Japanese cities, the preparation for a land invasion that military planners estimated might cost 1 million American casualties. In August 1945, the atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's capitulation, and on September 2, 1945, aboard the battleship USS Missouri anchored in Tokyo Bay, Fleet Admiral Chester W. Nimitz stepped forward and signed the Japanese instrument of surrender on behalf of the United States of America. The war was over. Nimitz had fired, by his aide's estimate, at least 500,000 rounds along the way. There is a temptation, when we study great commanders, to look for the dramatic gestures, the bold charge, the defiant speech, the moment of genius that appears in paintings and films. We want our heroes large, loud, and obviously heroic. Chester Nimitz confounded this expectation every day he held command. He was not theatrical. He was not loud. War correspondents went home disappointed by his refusal to perform for them. He never raised his voice. He never cursed. He expressed his most withering criticisms in quiet private conversations rather than public humiliations. And when the most important battles of the Pacific War were in their critical phases, he was on a pistol range, thinking of nothing but pulling the trigger. What does this teach us? It teaches us that the greatest commanders are not the ones who feel the most, but the ones who see the most clearly. And that clarity requires maintenance. The human mind under sustained extreme pressure does not sharpen indefinitely. It dulls. It narrows. It begins to see threats everywhere and opportunities nowhere. It begins to mistake the noise of fear for the signal of intelligence. Nimitz's fleet surgeon understood this, and Nimitz, with the intellectual honesty of a man who had spent 40 years studying his own weaknesses, accepted the prescription and followed it. There is also a lesson in the contrast with MacArthur. Not a dismissal of MacArthur, who was a genuine military genius with his own formidable record, but a recognition of two different relationships to uncertainty. MacArthur believed that willpower could master the unknowable. Nimitz believed that wisdom lay in accepting the unknowable and protecting one's capacity to respond to whatever it revealed. Midway proved which philosophy was right, at least for the kind of war the Pacific required. And perhaps the deepest lesson is this. The weapons that won the Pacific War were not only the carrier aircraft and submarines and cryptanalysts, as essential as all of those were. One of those weapons was a pistol range at Macalapa Hill, and a fleet surgeon's prescription, and an admiral who understood that the most dangerous enemy a commander can face is the panic inside his own mind. A general without bullets can still lose a war. A commander without clarity has already lost it. Chester Nimitz kept his clarity, and so he kept the Pacific. If this story moved you, if it gave you something worth thinking about, please subscribe to this channel. Hit the like button and turn on the bell so you don't miss the next story. History is full of men and women who changed the world not through spectacle, but through discipline, through the quiet, daily practice of keeping themselves capable of what the moment required. Those are the stories worth telling, and we will keep telling them.